Thank you very much for joining us for day 2 of the Island of Hope. We're delighted to have you here, and we're delighted to have this range of discussions over these 5 days focused on the specific needs of island communities and coastal areas when it comes to climate and the many, many areas that relate there, from tourism to transportation to mitigation, adaptation, etc. Now, I'm very delighted today to be joined by the Right Honourable Sir Alok Sharma, who I'm sure you remember was the president of COP26 and will be discussing the progress on climate and everything else we've been discussing these weeks since COP26 and beyond. So thank you very much, Alok, for being here today.
Thank you, James.
So we can start off 2 years on. What are your reflections, and how do you think that we have progressed between COP26 and COP28, and how would you evaluate the status quo of where we are today?
Yeah. So firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this. I think it's fabulous that you've got this program running throughout this COP. Look, if we look back to just over 2 years ago, we had a situation where COVID was still enveloping the world. We had our economies incredibly stretched as a result of coping with the issues of COVID. And of course, the geopolitics was getting worse, and unfortunately got even worse with Putin's illegal and brutal invasion of Ukraine. But nevertheless, we did manage to get almost 200 countries to sign up to the Glasgow Climate Pact. And the overall impact of that was the International Energy Agency estimated that if you add up all the commitments that were made at COP26, we were heading towards 1.8 degrees of global warming. So we had managed to bend the arc from, scientists were telling us before Paris we were heading towards 4 degrees, post-Paris 3 degrees, post-Glasgow 1.8. But at the time, I said this was a fragile win and that 1.5 was on life support. And I'm afraid it remains on life support. And that's because countries have not accelerated and delivered all the things that were promised. Yes, we have seen a lot more renewable energy deployed. Yes, we've seen electric vehicles deployed at much faster pace. But the reality is that we're now at 1.2 degrees, and you see the warning signs everywhere. You see them in many of the countries and islands that are represented here. And so the big issue for me is it's one thing to make promises for countries and companies. The other is to deliver. And that is what I think we need to see at this COP, delivery. And I'm really pleased that Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber set out very clearly that the North Star of this COP is going to be to keep 1.5 alive. So I hope at the end of this COP, we can say with confidence that we are keeping 1.5 alive.
So I think it was Friday, the loss and damage announcement that came through, and that took people by surprise in a way that we had that announcement so early on. I'm curious for your reflections on that announcement, if it was what you expected, and what you see as the key battlegrounds, I guess, as we move forward on loss and damage.
Look, if we look back, there was a big discussion at COP26. Some of you will have been involved on the loss and damage discussion. We didn't move as far as I think many people would have liked at COP26 on that issue. Then last year, I think we had actually a historic outcome at Sharm el-Sheikh with the agreement on loss and damage, and that carried forward. And I want to thank all the folks in the Transitional Committee who worked so hard to deliver what came out at this COP. I think it's actually a very positive development. I think it's great that we've got countries pledging, but I just want to make one point here on pledging money. Right? We know that between 2013 and 2021, only half of what developed countries have promised has actually flowed. So it goes back to this point, delivery and then action, commitments on finance, and then getting that money to flow. So I hope that money will flow. So I think that's been a really positive start. But of course, we know that we're going to need a lot more money, trillions, if we're going to transform the global economy to net zero.
And do we see that money coming forward? Do we see that? Do you think that's realistic, the amount of money that is needed, that we're going to see pledges, given the slow pace of those pledges, and as you say, the challenges in actually enforcing those over the next few years? How optimistic are you on finding that funding?
So look, I mean, there are two things that I would like to see coming out of this COP. The one is on energy transition to clean energy, and we can talk about that, and fossil fuel, because that's a big discussion point here. The second thing is on finance. And look, in all these forums, and this includes people like me, you talk about the millions, we talk about the billions, we talk about the trillions. That means absolutely nothing to people on the front line of climate change. You know, if you are facing drought, if you're facing rising sea levels, if you're facing your crops failing, it's no good people in these forums talking about billions to trillions if the money isn't flowing. And I think that is the issue here, is in a sort of global system, the money isn't flowing fast enough. I think we've had some sort of good discussions so far on the reform of the multilateral development banks, but again, it's not fast enough. What it needs is the shareholders, those countries that are shareholders of these multilateral development banks, to say, enough, right? You need to take some risks. You need to get capital flowing. And so, you know, do we need this money to flow? I think 125 trillion is kind of the estimate some people have put forward for a global net zero economy. Yes, we do. But that needs to come primarily from the private sector, and the private sector will only invest if they can see that you know, there's a potential return, that the regulatory environment in countries is right. We've had discussions on concessional finance, all of these sort of products that just need to come forward a lot faster.
So you mentioned those on the front line of the climate crisis, and as you know, this is the Island of Hope stage focused on small island developing states and subnational island jurisdictions and the specific needs that those island regions have as the most vulnerable areas. I'm sure, and you mentioned already this week that you've had meetings with various leaders from the SIDS and the SNIDG regions, and I'm sure as COP26 president you also met with them. And I'm just curious to know your reflections on the role of leadership that those countries have had, and also the influence that they're able to have as small nations in this COP process.
Yeah. Look, so firstly, during our sort of COP presidency years, I traveled to 54 countries, many of them twice, some of them 3 times, some of them even 4 times. And I went to see a number of the small island states as well. And I remember going to Barbuda and literally standing in the middle of this island some years after Hurricane Irma had sort of blown through. And, you know, for me, I was absolutely staggered, because although this event had happened some years earlier, it literally felt like a hurricane had blown in a few weeks earlier. Yes, there had been some restoration, but a lot of the buildings still damaged. And I had an opportunity to actually talk to some of the island leaders. And of course, a lot of people effectively forced to migrate because their homes had been destroyed. And that's going to be the other element, increasingly, where people cannot live in their homes. Where are they going to go? And what they said to me was that they were incredibly concerned that these climatic events were getting more ferocious and more frequent. And that's why they wanted the biggest emitters, the G20, to act. Now, I do think, actually, the islands have shown a huge amount of leadership. They have that sort of moral authority, being on the front line, not being responsible for the emissions that are creating the problems that we have, to be able to speak with authority. We had that with AOSIS going into COP26. That discussion is continuing now. And of course, you know, Prime Minister Mia Mottley has really kind of transformed, I think, that voice of the islands, both at COP26, but subsequently on the whole issue of finance. And I will always remember the incredibly powerful speech she gave at COP26. And she basically said, at 2 degrees, that's a death sentence for her country, and actually that is a death sentence for very many other people in low-lying island states. And that's why keeping 1.5 alive is so vitally important. And the other issue on finance, we've just got to get it flowing at scale. It is not flowing fast enough.
You mentioned your trip to Barbuda, and obviously Barbuda, as part of Antigua and Barbuda, is classed as a middle to upper income country, which presents some challenges when we talk about climate finance. And one of the big pushes by AOSIS at this conference has been the multi-vulnerability index, and looking at other ways of GDP to measure the impact and the challenges that SIDS face. Because as we know, even as an upper or middle income country, you can still have your entire economy wiped out overnight. And are you seeing traction in these indices or other ways of measuring to highlight those specific vulnerabilities that are lost when it comes to GDP per capita measurements?
Yeah. Look, I think we do need to make a lot more progress, a lot faster on these issues. Because I remember when I was our International Development Secretary, we had a climatic event in one of these sort of middle-income countries. And I remember at the time saying to my officials, okay, well, let's deploy some support. And I was told, that's not possible because the ODA rules don't allow for that because it's a middle-income country. And this is exactly the dilemma that they face, is that one climatic event wipes out your whole economy in many cases. You've got to rebuild. You're adding on debt at the same time, and yet you're not getting the level of support that you should be getting. So there is work, of course, as you know, that's going on in terms of pausing payments with debt clauses. All of that just needs to be speeded up. And I'm sorry I sound sort of really frustrated here, but I've seen this for a number of years, and there's a lot of talk, and we all talk a good talk, but it's a question of whether people are able to walk at the right pace or not. Someone said to me recently, you need to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time, and that's not happening. That's not happening fast enough.
So to take a different angle here, you're no longer serving in the UK government, but during your time in the UK government, there was a real push for the UK to be seen as a climate leader, especially when it came to renewables. How do you think the UK is faring now since COP26 and beyond when it comes to its climate commitments and progress on renewable energy and net zero?
Yeah. Look, I think it's fair to say, and I've said this publicly before, is that I think we've had some unfortunate rhetoric coming out of the government on this whole issue. We are still committed, legally binding, net zero by 2050, our near-term carbon budgets legally binding in place. But we've had some chopping and changing of policies. And I don't think that's great for the business community, because if you want people to invest in the long term, what the business community wants is for policies to be steady over a longer period of time, and that doesn't help. And we had a shift, the date by which we will expect all new cars to be zero-emission vehicles, basically zero-emission vehicles. We shifted that date from 2030 to 2035. The sector had been planning for 2030. But the second thing it does is send the message to international partners that somehow we are not as committed as we were previously. And that's I think, some of the message that's come across, which is a little bit unfortunate. And actually, the final point, which I want to get onto, is the whole issue of a clean energy transition. Right? That's the other big push that I want to see coming out of this COP. And it's great that we've got so many countries committing to tripling the amount of renewables capacity by 2030. And by the way, there are parts of the world like Africa where it needs to be 6 times as much, doubling energy efficiency. But we have to understand that 75% of all global emissions are energy related. And therefore, you have to address the issue of fossil fuels. We managed to get language on phase down of coal. It took 26 COPs to get there, right? 26 COPs to get there. And now there is a push, quite rightly, on phase out of fossil fuels. I hope we get there. And don't let anybody try and convince you that we can somehow use technology like carbon capture storage to cut emissions by over 40% by 2030, which is what we're told, the scientists tell us we need to do to keep on track. That technology is not deployed at enough scale, and it's not getting cheaper. So you have to address the issue of production. And just the final point from a UK government point of view is that I'm pleased that the UK government is backing language on phase out of fossil fuel in these negotiations. But, and I say this for every country, what you say internationally, you should then be consistent with in terms of your domestic policies. And right now, when it comes to oil and gas, if you invest £100 in oil and gas production in the UK, you get £91 back from the taxpayer. In my mind, that is encouraging potential projects to be invested in, which may not be viable in the medium to longer term. And that's why we need to address the issue of these reliefs and subsidies as well.
And this point you make on the renewable energy transition, I think, is very interesting for the islands. And actually, the UK government has invested in UK islands to help them make their transition to renewables. We also have the territories represented here, like Bermuda. They're doing a lot of work on renewable energy in that transition. And then, of course, the small island developing states themselves. It's not necessarily a matter of mitigation. Renewable energy is actually an adaptation tool for them to move forward. And so I think going back to the point about leadership, it's very good to see the island regions and island SIDS countries taking some leadership on the renewable energy transition on that front. So just to wrap up, we're here at COP28. We don't even know where COP is going to be next year, and there's a certain uncertainty about the future. There's been a lot of criticism about COP28, and as there is of every COP, of course, and the situation here in Dubai. How optimistic are you about the future, and what do you see as next for the COP process?
Look, we've had some good starts. We talked about the loss and damage fund, and I've said throughout this that you need to judge every COP and presidency on the outcomes. We will know in a number of days what the outcomes are. And yes, the UK faced criticism going into our COP, and that's right. Everyone should be questioned. I hope, as I said, what we will get at the end of this is to be able to say with credibility that we've kept 1.5 alive. Every COP builds on the next one. So I hope wherever that next COP is, we will see progress. But just one final point I want to make is that how many of you have seen this film, Don't Look Up? How many of you have seen that film, Don't Look Up? Okay, right, so I watched this film, Christmas 2022. I was absolutely exhausted after Sharm el-Sheikh. And it doesn't have a great ending, right? That's a bit of an understatement. And I feel a little bit like that about climate. There is this juggernaut coming towards us, and we kind of understand it's coming, but somehow we seem sort of almost paralyzed and not able to move fast enough. So the one thing that I would like coming out of this is that commitment from world leaders, from ministers, from countries and companies that they're going to really accelerate the pace. And if we do that, I think we will be able to say that we kept 1.5 alive.
And perhaps even the don't look up analogy, as slow as the onset of climate change is and the challenge that we have of actually articulating that, we're seeing every year these different climate impacts that people don't necessarily accept as that. So I think it's a very important analogy. So Alok Sharma, thank you very much for joining us here today at the Island of Hope, and those were fantastic insights. So we really appreciate all the work and the leadership that you've done when it comes to the climate change and COP process. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.